They called me the family disappointment who never made anything of herself after the military. Sarah's just working some dead-end paralegal job. My mother whispered as I stood there wearing the same blazer I'd worn arguing cases before the Supreme Court. Then the courthouse officer walked into my brother's courtroom, looked straight at me, and announced, "Your Honor, Justice Rodriguez, the Chief Justice needs you immediately." You could hear my brother's law books hit the floor, and for the first time in my life, my family couldn't speak. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The mahogany-paneled conference room at the Riverside Country Club smelled like old money and older disappointments. I sat at the far end of the table, invisible as usual, while my family celebrated Marcus's latest courtroom victory. He'd just won a $1 million settlement for a slip-and-fall case, and you'd think he'd argued before the Supreme Court the way everyone was fawning over him. "Marcus has such a bright future," my Aunt Patricia gushed, raising her champagne flute. "Partner track at Henderson and Associates by 35. We're so proud." My mother, Victoria, beamed like she'd personally trained him for the bar exam. "He's always been our golden child. Natural-born lawyer, just like his grandfather." She glanced at me with that familiar look of gentle disappointment. "Sarah tries her best, but after that whole military phase, she's just never quite found her footing." Military phase? Like my 8 years serving my country was some rebellious college experiment. Marcus loosened his tie and smirked in my direction. "Still doing that paralegal thing downtown, Sarah? Filing papers and fetching coffee?" He chuckled, and several cousins joined in. "When are you going to get a real job? Maybe I could put in a word somewhere, get you something entry-level." I kept my expression neutral, the same way I'd learned to control my face during hostile questioning from senators during my confirmation hearings. These people had no idea that the paralegal thing was actually my cover story, that I spent my days writing legal opinions that would shape American law for generations. "The legal field is so competitive," my sister Emma added, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "Maybe you should consider something more realistic? Corporate reception work? I know some people who might have openings." I nodded politely and sipped my water, the same way I'd stayed composed when Justice Thompson had tried to tear apart my constitutional arguments during my first week on the bench. If only they knew that 3 days ago I'd cast the deciding vote on a case that would affect voting rights nationwide. "Sarah's always been the dreamer," my father, Robert, said with a paternal sigh. "Remember when she used to talk about being a lawyer, then a judge? Such big ambitions for a girl who barely finished law school." The irony was suffocating. I had finished law school, summa cum laude from Harvard. Then came my military service as a JAG officer, prosecuting war crimes and handling classified military tribunals. After that, a rapid rise through federal courts, culminating in my appointment to the highest court in the land just 18 months ago. But to them, I was still the family disappointment who lived in a tiny 2-bedroom apartment. They didn't know it was actually a penthouse in Georgetown, or that I'd chosen it for its proximity to the Supreme Court building. They thought I took the bus to work because I couldn't afford a car, not because I was driven in an armored government vehicle with a security detail. "Maybe she could go back to school," Marcus suggested, cutting his steak with the confidence of someone who'd never been wrong about anything. "Get some practical skills. Accounting, maybe? Something stable." I almost laughed. Yesterday, I'd helped decide the constitutionality of federal banking regulations. Today, my brother was suggesting I learn to balance checkbooks. "The important thing is family," my mother concluded, as she always did when my failures became too uncomfortable to discuss. "Sarah may not have achieved what we hoped, but she's still our daughter." Achieved what they hoped. If they only knew that their disappointing daughter was one of 9 people who held the constitutional future of America in their hands. The weight of my secret pressed against my chest, like body armor I couldn't remove. Every condescending smile, every dismissive comment, every helpful suggestion about my career carved a little deeper into the carefully constructed wall between my 2 worlds. I excused myself from the family dinner and stepped onto the country club's marble terrace, pulling out my secure phone to check messages. 7 missed calls from my clerk, Rebecca. 3 from the Chief Justice's office. A text marked urgent from the Attorney General. My stomach tightened as I scrolled through encrypted briefings about tomorrow's emergency session regarding the constitutional challenge to the National Defense Authorization Act. Sarah, everything okay out here? Emma had followed me outside, her heels clicking against the stone. You look stressed. Work problems at what was it again? Johnson & Associates? Something like that, I murmured, quickly pocketing the phone. Emma didn't need to know there was no Johnson & Associates, that my real office was a palatial chamber with floor-to-ceiling law books and a view of the Capitol dome. You know, I've been thinking, she continued, settling beside me on the marble railing. Maybe it's time you considered a career change. You've been struggling with this legal thing for years now. There's no shame in admitting it's not working out. Struggling. If she only knew I'd written the majority opinion on 3 landmark cases this term alone. If she only knew that law students across the country studied my constitutional interpretations, that my former military service had given me unique insight into national security law that made me invaluable during wartime legal challenges. I appreciate the concern, I said carefully, but I'm managing fine. Emma laughed, the sound sharp against the evening air. Sarah, you're 34 and living like a college student. When Marcus was your age, he'd already made junior partner. You're still, whatever it is you're doing downtown. What I was doing downtown was reshaping American jurisprudence. Yesterday, I'd questioned the Solicitor General about surveillance overreach. Last week, I'd grilled a corporate attorney about environmental protection limits. But I nodded and smiled, the same diplomatic expression I'd perfected during Senate confirmation hearings when hostile senators tried to rattle me. Maybe I could talk to Richard, Emma offered, referring to her husband's law firm connections. Get you an interview for a secretary position. Good benefits, steady pay. More realistic than whatever pipe dreams you're chasing. Secretary position. I thought about my chambers, where tomorrow I'd review briefs that could determine the balance between federal power and state rights. I thought about the portrait of Justice Sandra Day O'Connor hanging behind my desk, the woman who'd paved the way for people like me to sit where previous generations never imagined a woman could belong. That's very thoughtful, I managed, but I think I'll stick with what I'm doing. Emma shrugged. Your choice, but don't wait too long. You're not getting any younger, and the legal field isn't exactly welcoming to women who haven't quite made it. I'd made it further than any of them could comprehend. I'd been nominated by the president, confirmed by the Senate, and sworn in before a crowd of thousands. I'd taken an oath to uphold the Constitution that I repeated silently every morning before reviewing cases that would impact millions of lives. But standing here on this terrace, listening to my sister plan my realistic future, I felt the familiar ache of living divided. Tomorrow, I'd help decide the constitutional fate of our democracy. Tonight, I was still just Sarah, the family disappointment who couldn't quite measure up to Marcus's slip-and-fall victories. The vibration against my ribs came at exactly 9:47 p.m., cutting through Marcus's elaborate toast about family values and professional excellence. My secure phone, the one only 5 people in Washington had the number to, was buzzing with an incoming call marked Chief Justice Emergency. I glanced around the table where my family continued their celebration, completely oblivious to the constitutional crisis unfolding in real time. Marcus was detailing his litigation strategy while Emma nodded approvingly and my parents beamed with pride. None of them noticed me stepping away from the table, my heart rate spiking the way it used to during combat missions in Afghanistan. Justice Rodriguez speaking, I whispered, ducking into the country club's empty library. Sarah, thank God. Chief Justice Margaret Chen's voice was tight with urgency. We need you back in Washington immediately. The Fourth Circuit just issued an emergency injunction blocking the military authorization provisions. 3 circuit courts are now in direct conflict, and the president is demanding immediate clarification on executive war powers. My mouth went dry. This was the case I'd been preparing for months. The constitutional challenge that could redefine the separation of powers during wartime. The kind of decision that would be studied in law schools for decades. When, I asked, already calculating travel time back to D.C. Tonight. Justice Morrison is stuck in Denver due to weather. and Justice Walsh is in surgery. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. We need a quorum for the emergency session at 6 a.m. National security implications are severe. The Pentagon is holding military deployments pending our decision. I looked through the library's glass doors at my family, still laughing and toasting Marcus's minor legal victory. They thought his slip-and-fall case was the pinnacle of legal achievement. They had no idea their disappointing daughter was about to help determine whether America could deploy troops without congressional oversight. "Sarah, are you there?" "Yes, I'm here. I'll need transportation arranged." "Already done. Marine helicopter will pick you up at the local airport in 90 minutes. This is classified at the highest level. You know the protocol." Protocol. No explanations, no details, no way to tell my family why I suddenly had to leave. Just another mysterious work emergency that would reinforce their image of me as unreliable and uncommitted to family obligations. "I understand. I'll be ready." "And Sarah?" The Chief Justice's voice softened slightly. "This decision could be historic. Constitutional scholars will debate what we write tonight for generations. I need to know you're prepared for that level of responsibility." I thought about my military service, the life and death decisions I'd made as a JAG officer in war zones. I thought about the confirmation hearings where senators had grilled me for 16 hours straight. I thought about the oath I'd taken 18 months ago, promising to defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. "I'm ready," I said. "Good. See you at dawn." The line went dead. I stared at my reflection in the library's darkened window. Still wearing the same navy blazer my family saw as evidence of my professional struggles, the same blazer I'd worn while writing opinions that shaped American law. In 6 hours, I'd be sitting in the highest court in the land, deciding the constitutional fate of military power. But first, I had to explain to my family why their struggling paralegal daughter was abandoning another family gathering for yet another mysterious work crisis. I straightened my shoulders and walked back toward the dining room, knowing this might be the last family dinner where they saw me as small. 3 days later, I stood in the back of Marcus's courtroom, watching him deliver closing arguments in what he called the case of his career, a personal injury lawsuit against a hotel chain. The irony wasn't lost on me. While he fought for a 6-figure settlement, I'd just spent 72 hours crafting a constitutional opinion that would affect military operations worldwide. My family sat in the front row like proud spectators at a championship game. Mother wore her best pearls, father had taken time off work, and Emma live-streamed portions for her social media, captioning it, "My brilliant brother changing lives." They'd invited everyone, aunts, uncles, family friends, to witness Marcus's moment of legal glory. I'd slipped in quietly, hoping to show support despite the exhaustion weighing on my shoulders. The emergency Supreme Court session had ended just hours ago, with my majority opinion becoming the defining precedent for executive military authority. But here I was, still playing the role of the struggling sister who had nothing better to do than watch real lawyers work. Marcus was hitting his stride, gesturing dramatically toward the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, this isn't just about monetary compensation. This is about justice, about holding powerful corporations accountable for their negligence." The courtroom doors opened with a soft whoosh, and I turned to see Officer Daniel Martinez from the Supreme Court's security detail stepping inside. He wore his formal uniform, the one reserved for official court business, and his expression was serious as his eyes scanned the gallery. My stomach dropped. This couldn't be happening. Not here, not now, not in front of my entire family. Labore. Officer Martinez's gaze found mine, and he began walking purposefully down the center aisle. Every step echoed in the suddenly quiet courtroom. Marcus paused mid-sentence, confusion flickering across his face as this uniformed official approached his audience. "Excuse me," Marcus called out, his lawyer instincts kicking in. "Sir, this is a private proceeding. If you have business with the court, you'll need to speak with the clerk." Officer Martinez didn't slow down. He walked directly to where I stood in the back, his posture rigid with formal protocol. The entire courtroom had turned to stare. My family, the jury, opposing counsel, court staff, everyone. "Your Honor," Officer Martinez said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent room. Justice Rodriguez, the Chief Justice requires your immediate presence for an urgent conference regarding the Morrison case appeal. The words hung in the air like a physical force. I watched my mother's face drain of color, saw my father's mouth fall open, witnessed Marcus's confident expression crumble into pure bewilderment. Emma's phone slipped from her suddenly nerveless fingers. "I'm sorry," Marcus stammered, "but there must be some mistake. This is Sarah Rodriguez. She's not a judge. She's a paralegal." Officer Martinez turned slightly toward Marcus, his expression professionally neutral. "Sir, I'm addressing Justice Sarah Elena Rodriguez, Associate Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States, appointed by President Harrison and confirmed by the Senate 18 months ago." The silence that followed was deafening. You could hear the courtroom's air conditioning cycling on. You could hear someone's stomach growling. You could hear my mother's sharp intake of breath as she pressed her hand to her chest. I straightened my spine and nodded to Officer Martinez. "Thank you, officer. Please inform the Chief Justice I'll be there within the hour." Marcus's closing argument was forgotten. His career-defining moment had just been overshadowed by the revelation that his disappointing sister was one of the 9 most powerful judges in America. I left Officer Martinez waiting outside the courtroom and walked directly to my family, still frozen in their front row seats like statues carved from chalk. The jury was dismissed, opposing counsel whispered frantically among themselves, and Marcus stood behind his table looking like someone had just told him gravity worked backwards. "We need to talk," I said quietly to my parents. "All of us, somewhere private." 20 minutes later, we sat in the empty conference room of Marcus's law firm, the same room where he'd celebrated making junior associate 3 years ago. The mahogany table that had seemed so impressive then now felt small compared to the Supreme Court's deliberation chamber, where I'd spent the last 72 hours. "Sarah," my mother began, her voice barely above a whisper, "what just happened back there? That man, he called you a Supreme Court justice. That's impossible. You're working as a paralegal. You live in that tiny apartment." "It's not tiny," I interrupted gently. "It's a 2-bedroom penthouse in Georgetown. And I'm not a paralegal. I never was." The silence stretched between us like a chasm. Emma was recording everything on her phone until I held up my hand. "This conversation is classified. No recordings, no social media, no telling anyone until I give you permission." "Classified?" Marcus finally found his voice. "Sarah, what the hell is going on? You can't just be a Supreme Court justice." I would have known. We all would have known. I opened my briefcase and pulled out a folder I'd carried for months, waiting for this moment. Inside were photographs, me taking the oath of office, shaking hands with the president, standing with my fellow justices in their formal robes. News clippings with my name in headlines, but small enough that a casual observer might miss them. Sarah Elena Rodriguez, I read from an official document, nominated by President Harrison on March 15th, confirmed by the Senate on May 3rd, sworn in on May 20th as the youngest associate justice in Supreme Court history. I looked up at their stunned faces. I was 32. The ceremony was broadcast on C-SPAN. My father picked up one of the photographs with trembling hands. "This is you. This is really you with the president." "Why?" Emma's voice cracked. "Why didn't you tell us? Why did you let us think you were struggling, that you were a failure?" I took a deep breath, the same way I prepared before delivering oral arguments that would change constitutional law. Because every time I tried to share any success, any achievement, you found ways to diminish it. When I graduated summa cum laude from Harvard Law, Mother said I was showing off. When I was accepted into the military's Judge Advocate General program, you said I was running away from real responsibility. When I won the Bronze Star for my service in Afghanistan prosecuting war crimes, you said the military gave out medals for participation now. My mother's face crumpled. "We never said." "You said all of that and more," I continued, my voice steady despite the years of pain behind it. "So when the president nominated me, when I went through confirmation hearings that lasted for weeks, when I became one of 9 people who interpret the Constitution for 300 million Americans, I decided to see how long it would take for you to notice. How long before you realized that your, quote, disappointing daughter had become one of the most powerful judges in the world. The room fell quiet, except for Emma's soft crying. Marcus stared at the photographs like they were evidence in a case he couldn't comprehend. 18 months, I said finally. It took 18 months, and you only found out because duty called. My father was the first to break the silence, his hands shaking as he set down the photograph of me with the president. Sarah, we. He stopped, unable to finish the sentence, his eyes filling with tears I hadn't seen since his own father's funeral. How could we not know? My mother whispered, staring at the official Supreme Court portrait in her lap. How could we be so blind? Our daughter is a Supreme Court justice, and we thought she was struggling to pay rent. Marcus leaned back in his chair, running his hands through his hair. Jesus, Sarah, when I was bragging about making junior partner, you were literally interpreting the Constitution. When I was celebrating that slip-and-fall settlement, you were deciding cases that'll be in history books. That's not the point, I said, my voice sharper than I intended. This isn't about comparing achievements. This is about 18 months of family dinners where you talked about me like I was broken. 18 months of suggestions about realistic career changes while I was writing legal opinions that affect millions of people. Emma looked up from her hands, mascara streaked down her cheeks. But why didn't you correct us? Why didn't you just tell us the truth? Because I wanted to see if you'd ever ask. The words came out harder than I meant them to. I wanted to see if anyone in this family would ever be curious enough about my life to discover that I wasn't actually failing. I wanted to know if you loved me enough to pay attention. The accusation hung in the air like smoke. My mother's face went pale, then flushed with shame. We thought we were protecting you. When you came back from the military, you seemed so intense, so serious. We thought if we could encourage you to find something simpler, something safer. Safer? I stood up, pacing to the window that overlooked the city where I'd grown up feeling invisible. I served 3 tours in Afghanistan. I prosecuted war criminals who had bounties on my head. I survived Senate confirmation hearings, where they tried to destroy my character for 6 straight days. But you thought I needed protection from what? Success? We were wrong, my father said quietly. We were so terribly wrong. Marcus cleared his throat, his lawyer instincts searching for the right words. Sarah, I need you to understand something. We didn't dismiss you because we thought you were incapable. We dismissed you because we were intimidated. Even before we knew about this, he gestured at the photographs. You were always the smartest one in the room. You were already making us feel small just by being yourself. That's not an excuse, Emma said, surprising everyone. That's exactly the problem. We made Sarah feel like she had to hide who she was because we couldn't handle feeling inferior. She looked directly at me. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry we made you feel like you had to choose between being brilliant and being loved. My mother stood up slowly, walking toward me with tentative steps. Can you forgive us? I don't know how to fix 18 months of failing you so completely. But can you help us learn how to do better? I looked at each of them. My father's shame, Marcus's bewilderment, Emma's genuine remorse, my mother's desperate hope. For 18 months, I'd carried the weight of their dismissal alongside the responsibility of constitutional law. I'd wondered if revealing the truth would feel like victory. Instead, it felt like grief. Grief for the family dinners where we could have celebrated together. Grief for the conversations we never had. Grief for the daughter they never really knew. I don't know, I said honestly. I really don't know. 2 weeks later, my secure phone rang at 3:17 a.m. I'd been expecting it since watching the news reports about the overseas crisis, but my heart still hammered as I answered. Justice Rodriguez, this is General Patricia Hayes at the Pentagon. We have a situation that requires immediate Supreme Court intervention. I sat up in bed, instantly alert. I'm listening. 17 American soldiers are being held captive in a hostile territory. The president wants to authorize an extraction mission, but it would require crossing international borders without congressional approval. The mission launches in 8 hours, unless the court provides constitutional clarity on executive war powers under the Emergency Action Doctrine. My blood went cold. This was exactly the type of case my recent opinion had addressed. But the stakes were now flesh and blood instead of theoretical law. "General, one of those soldiers—" "Can you give me the names?" Paper rustled on the other end. "Staff Sergeant Michael Rodriguez, 82nd Airborne Division, age 26. My nephew. Marcus's son, who'd enlisted against his father's wishes 2 years ago. The boy who used to build Legos while I was in law school, who'd written me letters during my deployment that I'd kept in my military footlocker." "Justice Rodriguez? Are you there?" "Yes, I'm here. How long do I have to review the constitutional parameters?" 6 hours. The court needs to provide guidance before the mission window closes." I hung up and immediately called Chief Justice Chen, then the other justices. Within 2 hours, we'd assembled for an emergency session that would determine whether those 17 soldiers, including my nephew, lived or died. The Supreme Court chamber felt different at dawn, shadows long across the marble floor as we took our seats. I'd presided over constitutional crises before, but never with my family's blood hanging in the balance. "The question before us," Chief Justice Chen began, "is whether the president has constitutional authority to authorize military rescue operations across international borders without explicit congressional approval when American lives are in immediate danger." For 4 hours we debated precedents, constitutional text, and the balance between executive power and legislative oversight. Justice Morrison argued for strict congressional control. Justice Walsh pushed for broad executive authority. The others weighed in with nuanced positions that would have impressed my old law professors. I stayed silent until the final hour, when Chief Justice Chen asked for my opinion. "Your Honor," I began, my voice steady despite the personal stakes, "the Constitution grants Congress the power to declare war, but it also designates the President as Commander-in-Chief. When American soldiers are in immediate mortal danger, every minute of legislative debate increases the likelihood of their deaths." I thought about Michael, barely older than some of my former law students, somewhere in hostile territory depending on our constitutional interpretation to save his life. "However," I continued, "we cannot allow emotional urgency to override constitutional principles. The precedent we set today will govern executive power for generations." I paused, feeling the weight of both my judicial oath and my family bond. "I believe the president has narrow authority to authorize immediate rescue operations for American personnel in mortal danger, provided Congress is notified within 48 hours and given opportunity for review." The vote was 5-4 in favor of limited executive authority. The rescue mission was authorized. Chassaus, the hours ran. 8 hours later, I sat in my chambers when my personal phone rang. Marcus's voice was shaking. "Sarah, they got him. They got Michael. He's safe." For the first time in months, my brother wasn't calling me about court schedules or family dinners. He was calling because his son was alive, and his sister had helped save him. 3 days after Michael's rescue, my entire family gathered in my parents' living room. Not for a celebration or holiday, but for what my mother called a conversation we should have had years ago. The afternoon light filtered through the same curtains I'd grown up with, but everything else felt different. My father sat in his usual chair, but his hands held a manila folder I'd never seen before. "Sarah," he began, his voice thick with emotion, "before we say anything else, I need to show you something." He opened the folder and pulled out newspaper clippings, printouts from legal websites, screenshots from news broadcasts. Dozens of them, dating back nearly 2 years. Headlines about my nomination, confirmation hearings, judicial opinions I'd written. Every public mention of my name, carefully cut out and saved. "We knew," my mother said quietly. "We've known since the beginning." The words hit me like a physical blow. "What?" Emma leaned forward, tears already starting. "Dad has subscriptions to legal journals. He set up Google alerts for your name the day you left for law school. We've followed every case, every opinion, every mention of Justice Rodriguez in the news." I stared at the collection of articles, my mind reeling. "But you never said anything. You kept calling me a paralegal. You kept suggesting I change careers." Marcus cleared his throat, looking older than I'd ever seen him. "Because we were terrified, Sarah. Do you understand what it's like to know your sister is one of the most powerful people in America? To know she's making decisions that affect the entire country while we're arguing slip-and-fall cases? That doesn't excuse. I started. No, it doesn't. My mother interrupted. Nothing excuses how we treated you. But I need you to understand why. She picked up one of the news articles, dated from my confirmation hearings. Do you remember what Senator Morrison said about you during the hearings? About your military service? I remembered. Senator Morrison had questioned whether my combat experience made me, quote, too emotionally compromised to interpret constitutional law objectively. It had been one of the most brutal moments of the confirmation process. We watched every minute of those hearings, my father said. We watched them attack you, question your judgment, try to tear apart your character, and we realized that we'd raised a daughter who was so far beyond us that we didn't know how to protect her anymore. Protect me? I felt anger rising in my chest. By pretending I was failing? By making me feel small? By trying to keep you human, Emma said softly. By trying to make sure you still felt like our Sarah, not just Justice Rodriguez. We thought if we treated you normally, if we didn't constantly talk about your achievements, you'd stay connected to us. My mother's voice broke. We were afraid that if we acknowledged how extraordinary you'd become, you'd realize you'd outgrown us completely, that you wouldn't need your ordinary family anymore. I looked around the room at these people I'd grown up with, seeing them clearly for perhaps the first time. You think I became a Supreme Court justice to leave you behind? Didn't you? Marcus asked, his lawyer instincts cutting to the core. Look at your life, Sarah. Georgetown penthouse, government security detail, dining with presidents. When was the last time you actually needed any of us for anything? The question hung in the air, and I realized they were right about one thing. I had built a life that didn't require them. But not because I didn't want them in it. I built that life, I said carefully, because I thought you didn't want to be in it. Because every time I tried to share my world with you, you made it clear it was too much, too intense, too different from what you wanted for me. 6 months later, I stood at the podium of the National Press Club, looking out at an audience of constitutional scholars, federal judges, and legal journalists who had gathered for the annual Constitutional Law Symposium. The irony wasn't lost on me. The same week my family had spent years suggesting I find more realistic career goals, I was being honored with the Jefferson Award for Constitutional Excellence, the highest recognition in American jurisprudence. But today was different. For the first time since my appointment, my entire family sat in the front row. My parents had flown in from Phoenix, my father wearing the same suit he'd worn to my law school graduation, the day he'd quietly whispered, "I'm proud of you," while my mother worried about me setting my expectations too high. Emma had taken time off from her marketing firm, and Marcus had rescheduled 3 client meetings to be here. Even Michael was present, home on leave and wearing his dress uniform, the bronze star he'd received for the mission that my constitutional opinion had made possible, pinned to his chest. Ladies and gentlemen, the moderator announced, it is my honor to present Justice Sarah Elena Rodriguez, whose opinion in Morrison v. United States has been called the most significant interpretation of executive war powers since the steel seizure case of 1952. The applause was thunderous. I looked down at my notes, then set them aside. After 18 months of hiding, after years of feeling dismissed, it was time to speak not just as a justice, but as a daughter, sister, and woman who had learned the difference between being extraordinary and being heard. Thank you for this incredible honor, I began. When I wrote the majority opinion in Morrison v. United States, I knew it would be studied in law schools for decades. What I didn't know was that 3 weeks later, that same constitutional framework would help save the life of my nephew, Staff Sergeant Michael Rodriguez. I gestured toward Michael, who stood and nodded to the audience. The applause was immediate and sustained. This brings me to something I rarely discuss publicly: the personal cost of serving on this court. For nearly 2 years, I have maintained what intelligence agencies call, quote, compartmentalized living. My family believed I was struggling as a paralegal, while I was actually writing opinions that affect millions of Americans. This wasn't because of security requirements. It was because I had lost faith that the people who loved me could also respect the person I'd become. A murmur went through the audience. Legal journalists were already taking notes, sensing a story they hadn't expected. The night before the Morrison decision, I sat alone in my chambers, knowing that my constitutional interpretation might determine whether 17 American soldiers lived or died. One of those soldiers was my brother's son. I realized that the isolation I'd created wasn't protecting anyone. It was preventing the people I loved most from understanding the work that defines my life. I paused, looking directly at my family. My mother was crying, but she was also beaming with unmistakable pride. Constitutional law isn't just about legal precedents and textual interpretation. It's about the human cost of our decisions. When we interpret the separation of powers, we're deciding how much authority parents like my brother can entrust to leaders they've never met. When we rule on due process, we're determining what protection people like my parents can expect from their government. The Constitution isn't an abstract document. It's a living agreement that affects every family in America, including mine. The audience was completely silent now, hanging on every word. Justice Holmes once wrote that the law is not a brooding omnipresence in the sky, but a tool forged by human experience. My experience as a daughter who felt unheard, as a soldier who served in combat zones, as a woman who has been underestimated in every institution I've entered, that experience doesn't disqualify me from constitutional interpretation, it informs it. I looked at Marcus, whose expression had transformed from skepticism to something approaching awe. My family spent years encouraging me to pursue more realistic goals because they thought the law was too competitive, too hostile, too male-dominated for someone like me to succeed. They were trying to protect me from disappointment. What they didn't understand was that I had already succeeded beyond their expectations. I just hadn't learned how to help them see it. The applause began slowly, building to a standing ovation that lasted nearly 3 minutes. But I wasn't watching the crowd. I was watching my father stand up, tears streaming down his face, clapping harder than anyone else in the room. I was watching Emma hold up her phone, not to live stream for social media, but to record this moment for her children. I was watching Marcus mouth the words, "I'm sorry," and "I'm proud," at the same time. After the ceremony, as legal scholars and federal judges approached to discuss constitutional theory and precedent, my family waited patiently at the edge of the crowd. When the last handshake was finished and the final interview was complete, my mother was the first to reach me. "Sarah," she said, embracing me in front of a room full of legal luminaries, "I have never been more proud to be your mother, not because you're a Supreme Court justice, but because you chose to help us understand who you really are." For the first time in 2 years, I felt like both Justice Rodriguez and simply Sarah. And for the first time in my life, my family was celebrating both versions of me. 1 year later, I walked into the Georgetown Law School lecture hall, where I'd agreed to give a guest lecture on constitutional interpretation. The irony of the moment wasn't lost on me. The same family who had once suggested I abandon my legal dreams was now sitting in the front row of one of the nation's most prestigious law schools, watching me teach the next generation of constitutional scholars. But this wasn't just any lecture. Marcus had enrolled in Georgetown's part-time law program, trading his personal injury practice for constitutional law studies. At 38, he was the oldest student in his class, but his enthusiasm was infectious. He'd called me 3 months ago with a request that had left me speechless. "Sarah, I want to understand your world. I want to be able to have real conversations with you about your work." Emma had brought her 8-year-old daughter, Sophia, who sat wide-eyed as law students filed in around her. My niece had started telling her classmates that her aunt was a real-life superhero who helps decide what's fair for everyone in America. The innocence of that description had become my favorite explanation of my job. My parents had driven down from Baltimore, where they'd moved to be closer to D.C. after what my mother called the Great Awakening. My father had started volunteering with a veterans legal aid clinic, using his accounting background to help former service members navigate disability claims. "I can't argue constitutional law like you," he'd told me, "but I can make sure warriors get the benefits they've earned." "Good morning, future lawyers," I began, looking out at the eager faces of second-year law students. "Today we're discussing the evolution of constitutional interpretation, but I want to start with a personal story about the cost of being misunderstood and the power of authentic relationships." I walked to the center of the room, abandoning the formal podium. 2 years ago, my family believed I was struggling as a paralegal while I was actually serving on the Supreme Court. This wasn't because they were unobservant or uncaring. It was because I had learned to make myself small in spaces where I felt unwelcome, and they had learned to have limited expectations to protect themselves from disappointment. A student in the third row raised her hand. Justice Rodriguez, how did you bridge that gap between your professional authority and your personal relationships? I smiled, thinking about the family dinners that had transformed over the past year. By remembering that vulnerability isn't weakness, and that authentic relationships require both parties to show up as their full selves. My family couldn't celebrate achievements they didn't know existed, and I couldn't feel supported in work they didn't understand. Marcus shifted in his seat, and I could see him taking notes like the dedicated student he'd become. Last month, he'd submitted a law review article about the emotional toll of constitutional decision-making on judicial families. His professor had called it surprisingly sophisticated for a first-year perspective. The Constitution, I continued, is ultimately about relationships between citizens and government, between state and federal power, between individual rights and collective needs. Those relationships only work when all parties are operating with complete information and good faith engagement. After the lecture, as students approached with questions about career paths and constitutional theory, I watched my family interact with the law school environment that had once seemed so foreign to them. Emma was deep in conversation with a student about the intersection of marketing and legal communication. My father was examining the portraits of famous alumni with the same careful attention he'd once reserved for financial statements. But it was my mother's conversation that stopped me in my tracks. She was talking to a young woman who looked frustrated and overwhelmed. My family keeps asking when I'm going to quit law school and do something more practical, the student was saying. They think I'm wasting my time chasing impossible dreams. My mother nodded knowingly. I used to say things like that to my daughter. I thought I was protecting her from disappointment, but I was actually telling her that her dreams were too big for someone like her to achieve. The student looked surprised. What changed your mind? She became a Supreme Court justice, my mother said simply, and I realized that my job as her mother wasn't to make her dreams smaller. It was to make my vision of her possibilities bigger. The student's eyes widened as she processed this information. Your daughter is Justice Rodriguez? My daughter is Sarah, my mother corrected gently. She happens to also be Justice Rodriguez. But first and always, she's the girl who used to practice oral arguments with our cats as her jury. The dreams were always real. I just needed to learn how to see them. That evening, we gathered at my Georgetown penthouse for our monthly family dinner, a tradition that had evolved from awkward obligation to genuine celebration. Michael was there on weekend leave, still wearing his sergeant's stripes, but now also sporting a Georgetown Law t-shirt. He'd been accepted to the law school's veterans program for the following fall. You know what's funny? Marcus said, raising his wine glass. I used to think Sarah was the family disappointment, and it turns out she was the family overachiever. But the real revelation isn't that she's extraordinary. It's that we all are, in our own ways. We just needed to learn how to see each other clearly. Emma nodded, bouncing her baby son on her lap. Sophia asked me yesterday if Aunt Sarah is famous. I told her that famous isn't the same as important, and that Aunt Sarah was always important to us. We just forgot how to show it. My father stood up, his voice thick with emotion. Sarah, I want to say something I should have said 18 months ago when that officer walked into Marcus's courtroom. I'm not proud of you because you're a Supreme Court justice. I'm proud of you because you're exactly who you were meant to be, and you never let our limitations convince you to be anyone smaller. As I looked around the table at these people who had learned to see me fully, who had expanded their own lives to understand mine, I realized that the most important constitutional principle I'd ever applied wasn't in any court opinion I'd written. It was the understanding that authentic relationships, like constitutional democracy, require both parties to show up as their complete selves, with all their complexity and potential intact. The girl who had once felt invisible in her own family was now surrounded by people who not only saw her clearly, but had been transformed by learning to see themselves more clearly too. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.